Security guard breaks black boy's arm for looking suspicious. The sudden crack echoed through the quiet, cavernous parking garage, louder in his ears than it had any right to be. In that instant, all her breath lodged in her chest, her heart slamming against her ribs as she realized the security guard had just twisted the boy's arm at an impossible angle. She heard a half-strangled howl of pain, a terrified wail that rattled off the concrete columns and sliced straight into her core. For a moment, she couldn't process what her eyes were seeing, the uniformed guard towering over a slight, trembling teenager whose face contorted in agony, shock, and confusion. And then, worse than the snapping sound, worse than the boy's anguished scream, was the guard's voice, a cold, pitiless accusation swirling through the frigid air. He looked suspicious. She didn't know his name yet, this child whose arm now hung limp at his side, tears streaking his cheeks as beads of sweat gathered at his hairline. She didn't know why he was there, or why the guard had chosen him for this violent confrontation. All she could register was his pain. Her mind stuttered, trying to comprehend the abruptness of this brutality. Someone so young, so fragile, and so alone, pinned down by a grown man with too much confidence, too much authority, and too little empathy. Even in the half-light of the garage, she could see the boy's face going ashen. His heels clacked loudly as she rushed forward, her phone gripped so tightly in her hand that her knuckles turned white. She raised it, capturing the scene. This might be the only protection the boy would have against further injustice. She could scarcely believe what was happening. A security guard, somewhere in his mid-40s, with a jaw set in self-righteous fury, pressing his knee into the kid's back and forcing him against the hood of a parked car. The brutality radiating from him was palpable. Could see from the expression on his face that, in his mind, he had done nothing wrong. He believed he was teaching a lesson, one the boy apparently deserved. "I'm calling the police," shouted, her voice ricocheting off the concrete. Her own hands shook, adrenaline surging through her as the boy locked eyes with her, terror etched across his features. Behind the guard's stern glare, she spotted the faint flicker of realization that he might have gone too far, but it was quickly overshadowed by his indignation. "Mind your own business," the guard snarled, trying to conceal the tremor in his own voice. "This doesn't concern you. This kid was sneaking around, acting suspicious, and I have the right to detain him." His voice cracked. "You broke his arm. He's a child, for God's sake." She saw how the boy's chest rose and fell in panicked breaths, and for an instant she was terrified the guard would harm him further, hurt him in a way that couldn't be undone. She was no longer a mere bystander, and she knew it. She needed to do something, she just didn't know what would be enough. A car swept by, headlights illuminating the boy's face, and saw how young he truly was, maybe 13 or 14 at most. Tall for his age, perhaps, but not tall enough for the guard to claim he was a man. The second wave of horror crashed over her. He was just a boy. A black boy, singled out in a place where he had every right to be, yet treated like a criminal. She fought back tears, swallowing hard as she pressed the phone to her ear, describing to the 911 operator everything she was witnessing. What followed felt like a blur of chaotic, disjointed images. The guard kept the boy pinned, ignoring his cries, ignoring his furious questions, until the wail of sirens began to penetrate the underground acoustics. The boy's knees buckled from pain and shock, his voice cracking in sobs that were equal parts agony and terror. Stood by, simultaneously helpless and enraged, her phone pointed, capturing whatever she could, praying it might serve as proof. The paramedics arrived first, wearing expressions of shock and disapproval as they saw the contorted angle of the boy's arm. That moment, the sight of medical professionals stepping in with calm authority was almost as overwhelming as the initial break. Felt her knees go weak, tears gathering in her own eyes despite her attempts to remain stoic. She watched as they coaxed the guard away and carefully laid the boy onto a stretcher. The guard hovered, arms crossed, an air of impatient arrogance about him. When the paramedics dared to question how the injury had occurred, his face darkened. He wouldn't stop, he was resisting, the guard insisted. In that instant, understood with startling clarity that he felt no remorse. In his mind, he was preserving order, fulfilling his duty by subduing a threat. She also realized this was probably not the first time he had used force to intimidate someone who, in his estimation, didn't belong. Her stomach churned at the thought. Then came the police officers, 2 of them. One tall and wiry, the other stocky with wide shoulders. They exchanged glances, approaching the scene with wariness. The tall officer's gaze flitted between the moaning boy, the outraged paramedics with her phone, and the security guard. For a split second there was uncertainty, but as soon as stepped forward, explaining in breathless detail what she had witnessed, that uncertainty shifted into something else. Her heart pounded as she pleaded, "Please, you have to arrest him." He broke the boy's arm. He had no reason. She pointed at her phone, shaky footage waiting to be shared. She wanted to believe the footage would resolve everything quickly, that justice would be immediate. In the real world, though, resolution rarely came without struggle. The boy, eyes foggy with pain, cradled his twisted arm as the paramedics worked around him, applying a temporary splint. One of the officers knelt by him, trying to calm him, but his attempt at gentleness seemed forced. After all, to the boy, there might be little difference between one uniform and the next. He was wounded, frightened, and alone. Wanted to run to him, to offer comfort, but she was also conscious that any sudden move might further escalate the situation. The stocky officer approached the guard, who was wearing a crisp uniform with a shiny badge that read Miller Security. A corporate outfit, supposedly employing men who had been lightly screened. Didn't understand how someone like this guard had been hired to protect a property. He emanated more menace than any possible intruder. "He was trespassing. Look, I caught him on camera," the guard insisted, brandishing a phone of his own. "He was lurking in dark corners, wouldn't respond to me, and tried to run when I confronted him." "I didn't," the boy tried to say, but the flare of pain in his arm silenced him. Tears glistened on his cheeks, and he shut his eyes tight, perhaps in an attempt to escape into darkness, away from the stars and the horror. His anger cut through her fear. "That's a lie," her voice echoed, surprising even herself. She had approached with caution, but now she was propelled by outrage. "I was here. I saw how quickly it happened." The boy barely had a chance to speak before this monster yanked his arm behind his back. She turned to the officers. "Please check my video." She handed the phone to the tall officer, her thumb still trembling over the play button. He took it, watched intently for a few moments, and pressed his lips into a grim line. Slowly, he exchanged a look with his partner. The guard, perhaps feeling cornered, glared at with open hostility. "I was doing my job," he spat. "He didn't belong here. Look at him, the guard stopped mid-sentence, as if he'd nearly uttered a word that would have revealed his entire prejudice. But the implication hung in the air, tangible and bitter. The second officer, the stocky one, inhaled deeply before exhaling with forced patience. He turned to the guard, arms crossed, and asked, "What exactly made you think he was suspicious?" The implied question was obvious. Was it simply the color of his skin, or was there something else? Tension hovered around them like a tangible fog, everyone's breath tight and shallow as they waited for the guard to speak. "I have a right to protect this property," the guard declared. His defiance was unwavering, though a sheen of nervous sweat lined his brow. "He didn't respond when I asked what he was doing. He turned to run. That's resisting." His heart ached for the boy. She could see him shaking his head, tears squeezing out the corners of his eyes, though his words were locked behind the pain that was pulsing through his body. One of the paramedics spoke up, voice thick with compassion. "We need to get him to the hospital now. His arm's in bad shape. We can't wait." The tall officer nodded. "Go," he said softly, stepping back to allow the stretcher a clear path to the waiting ambulance near the exit ramp. Stepped aside, too, her eyes tracking the boy as the paramedics guided him away. She wanted to call out to him, to tell him he wasn't alone, that she would do everything in her power to help, but she didn't know what words could possibly ease his suffering. Instead, she forced herself to remain strong, exhaling a shaky breath. As the ambulance pulled away, siren wailing, tension hung thick in the silence left behind. The guard stood, arms crossed, jaw tight, as though he believed any further condemnation would be a blatant insult. The officers quietly conferred, occasionally glancing at, who stood by with her phone still capturing the aftermath. Minutes later, they took the guard's statement, scrawling notes, occasionally glancing at his phone again to confirm certain details. The guard's posture grew stiffer, his words more clipped, as if aware that he might be in serious trouble. Tried to calm her racing pulse, tried to convince herself that justice would be done, that the footage she'd provided would lead to the correct outcome. But a creeping doubt tugged at the back of her mind. When the officers turned to speak to her, their eyes were shadowed with fatigue or perhaps resignation. "We have your contact information. We'll need you to come down to the station for a full statement," the tall one said. He sounded weary, nodded vigorously. "Of course." They left after that, two police officers, one disgraced security guard, all trailing away as if the worst part of the night was behind them. But for everything felt irreparably changed. The shocking violence she'd just witnessed, the cruelty inflicted so abruptly, stirred something deep inside her. Even as she walked out of the parking garage into the cool night air, she felt a nauseating mixture of anger and helplessness swirling in her chest. In the hours that followed, she couldn't stop replaying the image of the guard's hand wrenching the boy's arm, the terrible sound of the fracture, the scream slicing through the stale air. She stared at the footage on her phone, tears welling in her eyes, uncertain what to do next. She was determined not to let this injustice slip through the cracks, but she also felt the weight of her own limitations. Who was she to take on a security company and demand accountability? And yet, she knew she had to try. Word about the altercation started to spread. A few early reports popped up online, the story told in hasty bullet points. Teen's arm broken by security guard. Witness allegedly has video. The local news station reached out too, having gotten wind of the incident through social media. At first, her heart was hammered in her chest. She had never been the center of attention, had never dealt with reporters. But when they called, she found herself agreeing to meet, to show them the footage, to explain what she had seen. She would tell the truth, whatever that might entail. That's how she found herself in a small, cluttered local news station the next day, sitting under bright, unflattering lights, her phone clutched in her lap. The reporter, an older woman named Sarah, sat across from her with a practiced, empathetic look. "We appreciate you coming," Sarah began. Her tone was gentle. "What you witnessed was terrible, and it's important we understand exactly how things transpired." Nodded, taking a shaky breath. "I just want the truth out there," she said, her voice quieter than she intended. As the camera rolled, she explained what she'd seen in the parking garage, every painful detail. Her eyes glistened with the memory. She told Sarah how she heard the snapping of the boy's arm, how the guard had pinned him, how the guard had insisted he was within his rights, how it was so clearly an assault. She even showed the footage, though they had to blur the boy's face on the news for privacy reasons. When the interview ended, felt depleted, as if she had poured out everything inside her and was left hollow. The segment aired that evening, stirring up shock and outrage on social media, with many people calling for the guard's arrest, for legal consequences, for some measure of accountability for the security firm. Others, emboldened by the anonymity of the internet, spewed vile comments, blaming the boy, insinuating that he probably deserved it, or that there must be more to the story. Each new wave of comments and debates left emotionally exhausted. She had done what she believed was right, but she hadn't expected the backlash or the grueling repetition of defensive rhetoric that always seemed to follow any instance of racially charged violence. By the next morning, the story had gone viral in the local region. Hashtags began circulating, some demanding justice, others adopting hateful undertones. His phone rang nonstop. She tried to keep her focus on the real issue. The boy, she wanted to find out how he was doing, if he had the support he needed, but she didn't know where to start. In the chaos of the aftermath, she had never learned his name. She checked with the local hospital, but confidentiality rules prevented them from disclosing any information about a minor. That was when she decided to go to the police station, not just to provide a statement, but to see if they had any information about the boy. Felt nervous stepping into the drab, fluorescent-lit lobby, the stale scent of coffee and copy paper instantly overwhelming her senses. She tried to stand tall, to project confidence. Approaching the desk, she cleared her throat. A weary-looking officer glanced up at her. "I'm here to give a statement about the security guard who broke that boy's arm," she said, her voice ringing with a determined clarity she was proud to muster. "And also, I want to know if the boy is okay. I just need to know he's safe." The officer's expression softened slightly, though it was also tinged with caution. "Name?" he asked, pen poised to take notes. She said, swallowing the lump in her throat. "I witnessed it, and there's video footage. I've spoken to a detective briefly over the phone, but I want to speak in person." He nodded, motioning for her to have a seat. "Detective is on the case," the officer explained. "I'll let her know you're here." Sat in a hard plastic chair by the wall, trying to calm her nerves. After what felt like an eternity, a short, slight woman with sharp eyes and a calm demeanor appeared. "Ms., she asked. "Rose, come on in," detective said, leading her down a narrow corridor to a small interview room. Inside, Detective thanked for her willingness to cooperate. She pressed record on a small device and recounted her story in detail, this time for the official record. Detective asked methodical questions: the angle of the boy's arm, the exact words the guard had used, how the guard had initially approached the boy, whether there was any sign the boy had done anything illegal. His voice grew steady, unwavering, fueled by a fierce desire for justice. When it was over, Detective switched off the recorder. "Thank you," she said, leaning forward, elbows on the table. "I need you to know that these cases can be complicated, especially if there's a possibility the guard will claim he was defending himself or the property." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "I saw the video. It looks bad." "Very bad. We're investigating thoroughly." His throat tightened. "Do you know anything about the boy? Is he okay?" Detective sighed. "I can't disclose much, but I can tell you that he's at the hospital and that his mother was. Her name is Carter. She's understandably very upset." After a moment's hesitation, added, "The boy's name is Malik Carter. He's 14. He doesn't appear to have done anything wrong." Oleg felt a wave of relief in at least knowing his name and his mother's. "I'd like to reach out, see if there's any way I can help," she said, but she hesitated, aware of privacy boundaries and the delicate nature of the situation. "Do you think that would be appropriate?" Detective tapped her pen on the desk. "It's not for me to decide, but I understand. If you want to reach out, there might be ways through the hospital, or perhaps a lawyer if they get one. My advice is to tread carefully. This could become a major legal matter." Thanked her as she left, she felt a surge of determination. The system could move slowly, she knew that. And she also knew that, often, people in positions of power managed to wiggle out of responsibility. But not this time, she told herself. Not if she had anything to say about it. Over the next few days, faced a barrage of media requests and phone calls. She was torn. Part of her wanted to keep pushing the story, to ensure it wouldn't vanish in the wave of the next day's headlines. Another part of her felt deeply uncomfortable in the spotlight, longing only to ensure that Malik and his mother would find justice. In the interim, the guard had been suspended pending an investigation, the security firm's official statement read. That statement did little to quell the public uproar, but it gave a small sense of vindication. At least he wasn't out there doing this to someone else. Through a series of connections, someone at the hospital who sympathized, a quiet phone call, a gentle appeal, finally managed to get in contact with Carter. When they spoke, his voice trembled with exhaustion, sorrow, and anger. She explained how she had rushed to the hospital in the middle of the night, only to find her son in surgery, his arm shattered in multiple places. The break had been severe. The doctors were concerned about nerve damage. Tears strangled words as she described the fear that gripped her. Listened, heart pounding. She apologized repeatedly, though she wasn't the one who had hurt Malik. She felt a sense of guilt, possibly because she had been there, watching, unable to prevent the harm from happening in the first place. Seemed relieved to hear from her, grateful that at least one witness was fervently on Malik's side. "I want to make sure that man never does this again," confided. "And that my son doesn't have to live with this scar and never see justice." Her voice trembled. "He's traumatized. Every time someone so much as raises their voice, he flinches. And his arm, he just keeps saying he didn't do anything wrong, but he's scared. He asked me if people always see him as dangerous. He's 14. His eyes stung with tears. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I promise I'll do whatever I can to help. I have the footage. I've given it to the detective, and the news has shown it. People are talking." Let out a long, shaky breath. "Thank you," she said. "The detective said we should speak to a lawyer. We don't have a lot of money, and she paused, voice tight. "I'll figure it out." Felt an overwhelming desire to help, to do more than just talk to reporters. "I can help with that, if you want. I know some people who could set up a fundraiser or raise awareness online. This shouldn't fall on you alone." Was silent for a moment. "Thank you," she said again, her voice full of emotion. "I just want to focus on Malik right now, but yes, we might need that help." So began a new chapter in his life that she had never planned or anticipated. She launched a small online fundraiser, explaining the situation, the hospital bills, the legal fees that might soon pile up for the Carter family. A flurry of donations, large and small, trickled in from strangers moved by the brutality of the story. At the same time, hateful comments appeared in the feed, alluding to stereotypes, misinformation, or blaming Malik. did her best to moderate them, but the emotional toll was steep. Every evening after her day job, she'd find herself on the phone with well-wishers, outraged citizens, or occasionally members of the press. She'd keep in touch with, updating her on the donations. The process forged a bond between them, an unlikely friendship born out of tragedy. Would send pictures of Malik smiling weakly in his hospital bed, a cast encasing most of his arm, tubes still taped to his wrist. He tried to smile, but there was a haunted look in his eyes that made his chest tighten. Days turned into a week. The story continued to gain traction. More details came to light. The guard's name was David Porter. He'd previously been fired from another security company for using unnecessary force, but had evidently been hired again by Miller Security with minimal background checks. The unraveling of this information ignited further outrage. People demanded to know why a man with that record had been entrusted to patrol a large parking facility, free to violently confront any passerby he deemed suspicious. Despite these revelations, hope wavered. She had watched enough news cycles to know that public outrage could burn hot but quick, and that it didn't guarantee a legal outcome. She worried that, even with the footage, David Porter might manipulate the narrative. Claim Malik was trespassing or acting aggressively. There was only so much a video could show, after all, especially when it started just before the altercation. Some might wonder if Malik had done something prior to the recording, but knew in her heart that even if there had been some misunderstanding, it could never justify breaking a child's arm. As the second week approached, official charges were finally filed. David Porter was charged with felony assault, use of excessive force, and endangering a minor. Miller Security, under intense scrutiny, distanced themselves, releasing a statement expressing regret and claiming they had terminated Porter. The local district attorney's office made a carefully worded speech about the importance of justice and accountability. In theory, it was a victory, yet found herself hesitating to celebrate. An arrest and charges filed were only the first steps on a complicated legal path, one that could stretch out for months or even years. Meanwhile, Malik was released from the hospital. His arm was still in a cast, and follow-up surgeries and physical therapy lay in his future. Met him for the first time in person at small home in a modest neighborhood on the outskirts of the city. When opened the door, her weary face lit up with a tired smile. Malik stood behind her, looking down at his sneakers, a swirl of shyness and lingering fear in his eyes. The cast on his left arm was bulky and somewhat hidden under a baggy hoodie. "Hi," said softly, stepping inside. "I'm really glad to finally meet you. I'm so sorry about everything that happened." She reached into her tote bag, pulling out a small gift, a book of inspirational stories and quotes, something she'd hoped might lift his spirits even a little. "It's for you," she added, feeling a bit nervous. Malik smiled faintly, a quiet thanks slipping from his lips. He accepted the book gently, shifting his cast uncomfortably. Noticed how careful he was with every movement, as though the trauma was still fresh in his muscles and bones. Ushered them into the living room, where sat on a worn but cozy sofa. A television in the corner silently replayed news coverage of some unrelated event. The volume was muted. Glanced at Malik, struggling to find the right words. She settled on honesty. "I just wanted you to know," she began, "I'm here for you. If you ever need anything, someone to talk to, or to drive you somewhere, or help with school, I want to help." She swallowed, seeing him watch her with cautious curiosity. "You did nothing wrong, Malik. I saw what happened. I know you didn't deserve any of it." Malik's eyes flickered with gratitude, but also uncertainty. I just went there to meet a friend," he admitted softly, glancing down at his feet. "A friend lives in the apartments near that parking lot. I was heading home, and I knew I shouldn't be out late. My mom's always telling me to be careful," but he stopped, biting his lip. "Then that guard just appeared, yelling at me, asking me what I was doing. I got scared. I tried to explain, but he wouldn't listen. Then he grabbed me." Felt a surge of empathy well up in her throat. She gave him a gentle nod, encouraging him to continue if he wanted. "He threw me against a car," Malik said quietly. "I remember the smell of the metal, the way the engine was still hot. It burned my arm. I tried to move away just an inch, but then," he swallowed, tears suddenly welling in his eyes. "I felt my arm snap. I've never felt anything like that before. I can't stop hearing it in my head." Blinked back her own tears, placing a comforting hand lightly on his shoulder. She didn't know what to say to ease the horror he had experienced. So she let him feel her sympathy, hoping it might lessen his sense of isolation. His voice joined in, low and thick. "You're not alone, baby," she said to Malik, crossing the room to sit beside him. She wrapped her arm around him protectively, and he leaned into her, wincing a bit as he tried to avoid jostling his cast. "We're going to do everything we can so that man pays for what he did, so you don't have to be afraid." Malik squeezed his eyes shut, nodding, but saw the tears slip down his cheeks. She didn't want to intrude on the mother and son's moment of closeness, but she felt compelled to offer something, a promise or a vow. She leaned forward slightly. "He will face consequences," she said, though she couldn't guarantee it. "We'll fight to make sure of that." Over the days that followed, legal developments sped forward. David Porter was arraigned, and the public saw him for the first time since the incident, dressed in a cheap suit, face pale and somber. He didn't look so intimidating under the harsh fluorescent lights of a courtroom. Was there, along with Malik, though Malik had his hoodie pulled low over his forehead, clearly anxious about the possibility of encountering Porter face to face. Watched as the charges were read aloud, as Porter's lawyer pleaded not guilty on his behalf. The tension in the courtroom was palpable, an electrified hush. His hands shook in his grip, and Malik sat rigid, flanked by his mother. The hearing concluded quickly, with a trial date set for a few months later. Porter was released on bail. The swirl of reporters outside the courthouse was intense, flashbulbs and microphones capturing every reaction, every nuance of body language. Did her best to shield Malik and from the barrage of questions. She found herself stepping in front of them when a reporter thrust a microphone in Malik's face, demanding a statement. "Please respect their privacy," snapped, adrenaline surging. The cameras pivoted toward her, but she refused to be flustered. If she had to stand between Malik and the world, she would. In the weeks that followed, juggled her normal life, her job at a local marketing firm, her small apartment near downtown, with this newfound commitment to helping the Carters. She sat beside in lawyer consultations, listening with mounting frustration at the complexities of the legal process, the ways the defense might try to discredit Malik's recollection. The fact that he had been out late, the fact that he had no direct reason to be in that specific section of the parking garage, it would all be used against him. "You're going to hear them twist everything," the lawyer warned gently. "They'll try to make Malik out to be some thug. They'll claim the guard smelled weed or that Malik reached for something in his pocket. I'm not saying it's right, but you need to be prepared." His face grew stony at those words, but his heart thundered with protective anger. Malik was a child. No child deserved that brutality, no matter the circumstance. She left the meeting feeling incensed, certain that a deeper sickness existed in a world that would question a boy's right to safety just because of how he looked or the color of his skin. Still, it wasn't all darkness. The outpouring of support for Malik, from various community groups, churches, and even local activists, was heartening. People showed up at rallies, carrying signs that demanded justice for Malik. At one event, Malik watched from the sidelines, his arm still in a cast, face drawn and pensive. Gently coaxed him to join in a group photo. He stood timidly, uncertain of how to respond to so many strangers chanting his name. But there was relief in his eyes, too, relief in knowing he wasn't fighting this alone. As the trial approached, tension mounted. The city seemed to be on edge, with local news channels running constant updates, analyzing the potential legal angles. Talk radio hosts argued about whether the guard had used reasonable force, or whether it was a clear case of brutality and racial profiling. The conversation spilled onto social media, dividing people along lines that found maddening. But she channeled her frustration into unwavering support for Malik, sending messages of encouragement, helping manage the growing wave of legal documents, keeping track of finances from the online fundraiser. Finally, the day came. The trial was set to begin early on a Wednesday morning. Arrived at the courthouse with, and Malik, all of them dressed in subdued, respectful clothing. Malik was especially nervous. He fidgeted with the edge of his sling, now a smaller brace since his cast had been removed, though the doctors warned he still needed to be cautious. Tried to offer a reassuring smile, though her own nerves were tightly coiled. The air was thick with tension as they entered the courtroom. David Porter sat at the defendant's table, flanked by a stern-looking attorney. Across the aisle, the prosecutor, a woman named Dahlia, sorted through her files, nodding once in greeting at Malik. She seemed confident but calm, exuding the aura of someone who believed in the righteousness of her case. Opening arguments began. Clenched her teeth as Porter's attorney tried to paint him as a diligent guard who had to make a split-second decision for his own safety. He saw a figure lurking in a dark corner late at night, the attorney intoned, pacing the floor. He identified himself, asked questions, but the individual would not answer. In the interest of public safety, my client had to act. Any injury that followed was an unfortunate accident. Sucked in a sharp breath, could feel the anger radiating from her, from all of them. The word unfortunate accident rung hollow in the silent air, a disingenuous phrase that trivialized the devastation Malik endured. The prosecution rose next. The victim is 14 years old, Dahlia said, her voice resonating with controlled fury. He was not armed, he did not make any threats, and he did not initiate any physical contact. The defendant, a man almost 3 times the boy's age, used an egregious amount of force that resulted in a severe fracture. This is not an accident, ladies, and this is assault. Witnesses were called. Found herself on the stand, hands shaking, but her voice steady as she described the fateful night in the parking garage. She recounted the guard's actions, the brutal snapping of Malik's arm, the disregard for the boy's pleas. The footage she had recorded was played in the courtroom. The silence that followed was tense, broken only by a few quiet gasps, kept her eyes down, unwilling to see Porter's reaction. But she heard a faint shuffle from the defense table, imagining his discomfort as the entire court watched his violence on screen. Malik also took the stand. He spoke haltingly, recounting the confusion he felt, how he had tried to explain he was just passing through to get home from a friend's, how the guard's aggression left him paralyzed by fear. Tears slipped down his cheeks when he described the moment his arm broke, the shock, the pain, the feeling of utter helplessness. Watched from the gallery, tears in her own eyes. When Malik stepped down, he looked drained, trembling slightly, but he had told his truth, prayed it would be enough. Over days of testimony, the defense hammered on the idea that Malik must have run, or that he refused to obey commands, suggesting that the guard was within his rights to detain a suspect. They scrutinized the footage's angle, pointing out any possible ambiguity. To his immense frustration, they even tried to shift focus onto Malik's prior activities that day, implying that the boy might have been somewhere he shouldn't have. But the prosecution held firm, emphasizing that none of Malik's choices could justify the excessive force used. Eventually, both sides rested, the jury to deliberate, leaving a hush over the courtroom that felt heavier than any sound. Held Malik's good hand while sat on his other side, shoulders tense. None of them spoke, each lost in an internal storm of fear and hope. After an agonizing day of deliberation, the jury returned. The foreperson stood, reading the verdict in a clear, unwavering voice. We find the defendant, David Porter, guilty of felony assault, guilty of using excessive force, guilty of endangering a minor. The words crashed over them like a tidal wave of relief, felt her chest seize as tears pricked her eyes, pulled Malik into a tight hug, sobbing, while Malik stared wide-eyed, tears sliding down his face. Across the courtroom, David Porter's expression darkened with shock and disbelief. His attorney placed a hand on his shoulder, already whispering about appeals. The judge set a date for sentencing, reminding everyone that justice was a process. But in that moment, and Malik felt the weight lift. This was a milestone. Porter had been held accountable. The tension in the gallery transformed into a buzz of relief and subdued cheering. As they filed out of the courtroom, reporters flooded the hallway, microphones thrust forward to catch any statement. Shielded Malik but stepped forward, tears still shining on her cheeks. She spoke only 2 words. Thank you. In the weeks that followed, the city buzzed with the outcome of the trial. Conversations about racial profiling, about security protocols, about systemic issues in the hiring of guards intensified. Miller Security faced numerous lawsuits and public condemnation for their lax background checks. People called for new regulations, new oversight. And in the center of it all, Malik continued to heal, physically and emotionally. His cast was off, replaced by intense therapy sessions. Noticed improvements in his mood, though the nightmares still visited him, and loud noises could make him jump. Healing, they both realized, would be a journey. Visited often, a friend to both mother and son. She watched movies with Malik, helping him with homework he had missed while in the hospital. She accompanied to legal appointments for the civil case against Miller Security, hoping to secure funds for Malik's long-term care. Their bond had grown unbreakable, forged by a trauma none of them had expected. On the day of sentencing, they all returned to the courthouse. David Porter stood before the judge, still in his cheap suit, shoulders hunched. He offered a brief apology, though it sounded rehearsed. The judge was unsparing, citing the seriousness of the offense and the malicious intent behind Porter's actions. He sentenced Porter to several years in prison, though the exact length was tempered by the complexities of law. Felt relief wash over her like a cleansing tide. She reached for Malik's hand and squeezed it gently, let out a small sob, pressing her lips together. Malik's lips parted, as though he couldn't quite believe it was over. When they emerged from the courtroom for the final time, the sun shone brightly outside, almost offensively cheerful. Took in the fresh air, tears lining her eyes, and turned to. "I can't ever thank you enough," she said, voice trembling. "You saved my son, not just that night, but every day since. We wouldn't have had a chance without you." Shook her head, swallowing a wave of emotion. "I just did what was right," she replied softly. "We all deserve to feel safe, especially Malik." Malik's eyes were still red-rimmed, but he managed a small smile. "Thank you," he said, voice hushed. "You believed me when—" He paused, looking away for a moment, then meeting her gaze again, "when maybe a lot of people wouldn't have." Tears slipped down his cheeks. She gave his hand a gentle, comforting squeeze. "I'm so proud of you," she whispered. She meant it. The courage Malik had shown in confronting the ordeal, in testifying against the man who had hurt him, was immeasurable. They lingered outside the courthouse, letting the warmth of the sun seep into their bones. Cameras still hovered, reporters wanting a statement. Answered a few questions, speaking about the importance of standing up against injustice, about how a community's support had helped her family navigate the darkest time of their lives. Stood at her side, providing silent solidarity. In the days that followed, life began to settle into a new, if slightly changed, rhythm. Malik continued his physical therapy, gradually regaining strength in his arm. The emotional scars they all knew would take longer. Worked fewer hours so she could be with him, the community fundraiser helping cushion the financial blow. Visited regularly, sometimes for an hour, sometimes for an entire afternoon, just to hang out, help with errands, or talk about everyday things, anything to remind Malik that his life wasn't defined by that moment of violence. Their city, too, seemed changed by the trial. Discussions about racial bias in security and policing gained momentum. The heartbreak endured by Malik became a rallying cry for policy reform. People who had once looked away from such issues found themselves confronted with the undeniable image of a broken arm, a child's screams echoing off concrete walls. Political figures, community leaders, and activists all weighed in, pushing for stricter guidelines on who could be employed as a security guard, how they should be trained, and the oversight necessary to prevent future abuses. One bright morning, swung by the Carter home with groceries, she found Malik in the front yard, carefully bouncing a basketball, a slow, measured action as he tested the limits of his healing arm. He turned at the sound of her car pulling up and gave a wave, a genuine smile lighting his face. It was the first time she'd seen him smile so freely since the incident. It felt like a victory beyond measure. Poked her head out the front door, smiling warmly. "He's been at it all morning," she said, relief evident in her eyes. "I told him not to push it too hard, but you know teenage boys." Laughed gently. She carried the bags inside, depositing them on the kitchen counter. Then she joined Malik in the yard. "You ready to take on the NBA yet?" she teased. He snorted a laugh, shaking his head. "Not quite," he admitted, but his eyes sparkled with the thrill of small progress. They spent the afternoon shooting hoops in the driveway. Malik's movements were tentative, but the grin that spread across his face whenever he made a basket was priceless. Watched from the porch, pride shining like a beacon. At one point, Malik handed the ball to and challenged her to shoot from the free throw line. She missed, prompting a round of good-natured teasing. Later, they collapsed on the small patch of grass, panting lightly. Malik cradled his braced arm, careful not to overuse it. He glanced at, a serious expression crossing his features. "Do you think," he said slowly, "that people like that guard-like Porter are everywhere?" Hesitated, pondering how to answer. She wanted to protect him from the ugliness of the world, but she respected his maturity. "I think," she said carefully, "that there are people who judge others unfairly. But I also believe most people are good, and a lot of them want to make sure things like this don't happen again." He nodded quietly, eyes distant. "I just wonder if people who look like me," he trailed off, lips tight, She reached out, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You deserve to be treated with respect," she said firmly. "No one can take that from you. And when someone tries, we speak up." He met her gaze, appreciation softening his features. A gentle breeze whispered through the neighborhood. The sun was warm, painting the street in a golden hue. In that moment felt a cautious optimism. The world wasn't perfect, not by a long stretch. But sometimes justice could be found, piece by piece, day by day, especially when people stood together. They headed inside, where had prepared sandwiches. Conversation drifted to light topics: school, favorite TV shows, upcoming community events. It felt like a normal family afternoon. And realized with some surprise that they had become like family, bound not by blood but by fierce loyalty and shared hope. Months passed. David Porter's appeal was. Malik's arm grew stronger, though a few scars and the occasional twinge of pain remained as reminders of what he had endured. Therapy sessions helped him navigate the residual trauma, though he still had nightmares now and then. Picked up extra shifts again, bolstered by the knowledge that her son was on the road to recovery. Continued to be a constant presence in their lives, forging memories that helped overshadow the dark ones. On the anniversary of the incident, 1 year since that fateful night in the parking garage, invited to a small gathering at their home. A few close friends and family came, and they grilled burgers, laughing and reminiscing. At one point when the sun was setting, Malik asked everyone to gather in the backyard. He stood in front of them, looking a little shy. He cleared his throat and gave him an encouraging smile. He began, fiddling with a piece of paper in his hands. "I just wanted to say thank you to everyone who supported me, believed me, and especially to." He glanced her way. She felt tears prickling her eyes. I don't know where I'd be if no one had cared that night, but you cared, and it changed everything for me." A hush fell over the small crowd. Someone sniffed, wiping away tears. Felt a wave of emotion so strong she could barely speak. She managed a smile and blinked away tears before stepping forward to give Malik a gentle hug, mindful of his arm, even though it was fully healed. "You're a great kid," she said. "I'm so proud of you." In the twilight, fireflies danced through the yard, little sparks of light against the deepening sky. The group lit a few lanterns, setting them adrift, a symbolic gesture of letting go of the darkness, of finding hope in the future. As watched the lanterns float higher, she felt a surge of gratefulness for the path that had led her here. It wasn't a path she would have chosen, witnessing violence, being thrust into the role of advocate, but she wouldn't trade the outcome. She had found a cause bigger than herself, and in helping Malik, she had rediscovered her own sense of purpose. The night ended with laughter and warmth, a stark contrast to the brutal memory of that parking garage. While the pain and injustice of what had happened could never be undone, something stronger had emerged from the wreckage. A bond that fear and prejudice, a story that sparked change in a community, and a testament to the power of people standing together against wrongdoing. When got home, she found herself reflecting on the journey. She thought of that initial moment, the horrifying crack of a breaking bone, the guard's snarling voice, the paralyzing fear she'd felt. That moment had set in motion, a chain of events that led to a fractured boy becoming whole again in more ways than one. And in turn, it had carved a place in his own heart she never knew existed. As she curled up on her sofa, exhaustion and contentment mingling, she gazed at a photograph on her phone. It was from earlier that evening, a snapshot of Malik and herself, arms draped around each other, smiling at the camera. In his eyes, she saw resilience, In's unwavering love, and in her own, a steady determination that hadn't existed before this trial by fire. The security guard had broken a black boy's arm simply because he decided the boy looked suspicious. But the guard had also unleashed a force that he never could have predicted, a network of people unwilling to let injustice stand, a fierce love that transcended fear. In the end, that love and determination had triumphed, pulling Malik and his family through the storm. And there, in the still of the night, allowed herself a small, grateful smile, knowing that in a world filled with shadows, a single act of bearing witness could be the spark that ignited a flame of hope, healing, and unbreakable resolve.